What happens when two beloved television personalities sit down for what should be a lighthearted conversation, only to find themselves caught in one of the most uncomfortable moments in daytime television history? Kelly Clarkson Show has always been known for its warm, welcoming atmosphere, a place where celebrities share stories, promote new projects, and connect with audiences in genuine, heartfelt ways. But on this particular afternoon, something shifted in the studio. Setting the stage for a moment viewers would be talking about for weeks. Valerie Bertinelli stepped onto the stage with her signature bright smile, waving as the audience erupted in applause. She settled into the chair across from Kelly, and for a while, everything felt perfectly normal. They exchanged small talk, laughed about the weather, and Kelly complimented Valerie on her latest cookbook. Then Kelly leaned forward with that inquisitive spark in her eye, the one fans recognize instantly as her signal that she's about to dig a little deeper. She asked Valerie about her journey over the past few years, gently referencing her very public divorce and the challenge of navigating life in the spotlight while going through such a personal transformation. Valerie's smile tightened, but she stayed composed. She opened up about rediscovering herself, learning to love who she was outside of marriage, and rebuilding her sense of identity. The audience listened closely, visibly moved by her vulnerability. Kelly responded with empathy, sharing her own experience of going through a difficult divorce. The conversation felt raw, honest, and deeply relatable till the moment it suddenly wasn't. Kelly brought up Valerie's recent social media posts about struggling with body image and the pressure she'd faced throughout her career to maintain a certain appearance. She praised Valerie for being so open, but then added a question that made the temperature in the room noticeably drop. She asked whether Valerie ever worried about sending mixed messages by posting vulnerable, body-positive content, while also promoting diet products and wellness programs. She wondered if younger women might see that as contradictory. The audience fell silent. Valerie's expression changed instantly. Her jaw tightened as she took a careful breath. She explained that her relationship with her body was a personal journey, and sharing her struggles didn't mean she had all the answers or that she was telling anyone else how to live. Kelly nodded, but she wasn't finished. She pressed further, citing comments from fans who felt confused about the contrast between Valerie's messaging and her brand partnerships. She asked whether Valerie had considered how that might impact her credibility. That's when everything shifted. Valerie straightened in her seat, and her voice took on an unmistakable edge. She told Kelly that the question was reductive and ignored the complexity of real people's experiences with body image. Women, she argued, are constantly placed in impossible positions, expected to be authentic, but criticized when that authenticity doesn't fit neatly into someone else's narrative. Kelly tried to clarify her intent, but Valerie was already gaining momentum. She spoke passionately about decades spent being told how to look, what to eat, how to behave, how to present herself, and how being honest about that struggle didn't obligate her to follow anyone's rules about what body positivity should look like. The studio fell completely silent. Audience members shifted uneasily, and producers exchanged anxious glances in the background. Kelly looked visibly stunned, clearly not expecting the conversation to escalate. She attempted to guide the interview back to safer ground by bringing up Valerie's upcoming projects. But Valerie wasn't done. She looked directly at Kelly and said something that sliced through the tension, like a blade for someone who claimed to champion women and authenticity. It was deeply disappointing to see Kelly use her platform to shame another woman for not performing vulnerability in the exact way people expected. Valerie continued by saying that this was exactly the kind of judgment that kept women silent about their real experiences, because no matter what they shared, someone would always find a way to twist it against them. Kelly's face flushed, and she opened her mouth to respond, only to close it again. The pause stretched on uncomfortably, feeling like an eternity, even though it was only a few seconds. When Kelly finally spoke, her voice carried a defensive edge. She insisted she hadn't meant to shame anyone. She was simply asking questions she believed the audience might be wondering about, and as a talk show host, she argued. It was her job to have difficult conversations. Valerie let out a short, humorless laugh. She said there was a difference between having difficult conversations and blindsiding someone with loaded questions meant to make them look hypocritical. She pointed out that Kelly didn't ask these kinds of questions to other guests who had contradictions in their public personas and wondered aloud why she was being held to a different standard. Kelly's eyes widened and she leaned back, visibly trying to maintain her composure despite the sting of Valerie's accusation. She said she asked all her guests tough questions, insisting it was part of creating meaningful dialogue, and that she wasn't singling Valerie out, but the slight tremor in her voice betrayed that. Valerie's words had landed deeply. Valerie shook her head, a sad but resolute smile forming. She explained that meaningful dialogue required good faith from both sides, and what she was experiencing felt more like an ambush than a conversation. She said she'd been genuinely excited to appear on the show, that she'd always respected Kelly's work. But this moment felt like a betrayal of the trust guests place in hosts when they agree to be vulnerable on national television. The audience was visibly divided, some nodding in agreement with Valerie, others glancing sympathetically at Kelly, while a few looked uncertain, unsure whose side to take as the interview continued to crumble. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every charged second. Kelly inhaled deeply and attempted to shift her approach. She suggested that perhaps the conversation had gotten off on the wrong foot, insisting she hadn't intended to make Valerie feel ambushed. She said maybe the question had come across differently than she intended, and emphasized that she valued Valerie's perspective on complicated issues. It was clearly an attempt to de-escalate and salvage the interview. But Valerie wasn't convinced. She said the problem wasn't how the question sounded, it was the entire premise behind it. She explained that women in the public eye are constantly expected to be flawless advocates for every cause they touch, never allowed doubt or contradiction, forced to rise above the messy, painful reality of being human. That expectation, she said, was exhausting and harmful because it meant women could never be truly honest without being branded hypocrites. Kelly interrupted, her frustration finally showing through. She argued that accountability wasn't the same as demanding perfection, and that anyone with a platform, especially one influencing people on sensitive issues, like body image, had a responsibility to consider the impact of their words and actions. Pointing out contradictions, she argued, wasn't tearing women down but encouraging thoughtfulness. Valerie's expression hardened. She asked if Kelly had considered that some contradictions weren't actually hypocrisies, but signs of someone actively working through complex issues in real time. Her relationship with her body, she said, had been complicated for decades, shaped by an industry that profited off her insecurities. And she was still figuring out how to navigate it. Why, she asked, did her journey need to be perfect before she was allowed to speak about it publicly? The conversation was spiraling. Kelly countered that Valerie had every right to talk about her experiences. But if she was doing so while profiting from weight loss partnerships, people had a right to question that. She said transparency mattered, and audiences deserved to know when advocacy might be influenced by financial interests. That landed like a bomb. Valerie's face went pale, then flushed with anger. She said that Kelly was now implying she was dishonest or mercenary in her advocacy, an accusation she called serious and unfair, especially on national television with no evidence. She then pointed out that Kelly also had corporate partnerships. Did that mean everything Kelly said on her show should be questioned through the lens of financial motivation? Kelly looked stunned. She stammered that her partnerships were differentless, closed, and separate from her editorial. Content Tan said she wasn't presenting herself as an advocate for specific causes while working with companies that contradicted those causes. But even as she said it, uncertainty flickered in her eyes, as though she realized the distinction wasn't as clean as she wanted it to be. Valerie seized the moment. She said everyone in the industry made compromises. Everyone had partnerships that didn't align perfectly with every value they held, and pretending otherwise was naive or disingenuous. She questioned whether Kelly truly cared about these issues, or whether she simply saw an opportunity to manufacture a dramatic moment for her show by putting a guest on the spot. Asterisk. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Kelly's face shifted through shock, hurt, anger, and defensiveness. She said she resented the implication that she would exploit someone's pain for ratings, insisting that her show was built on authenticity and real conversation. And then, with rising tension, she added that if Valerie couldn't handle challenging questions, maybe she shouldn't have agreed to come on a talk show. That was the breaking point. Valerie shot to her feet, the sudden movement startling the entire studio. She said there was a difference between challenging questions and hostile interrogation. She had done hundreds of interviews in her career, she said, and had never felt as disrespected as she did in this moment. Her voice trembled, whether from anger, hurt, or both was impossible to tell as she fought to keep her composure. Kelly stood, instinctively mirroring her. She reached out slightly, as though trying to bridge the emotional and physical distance that had opened between them. But Valerie stepped back. She said she had come on the show in good faith, ready for an honest conversation, and instead felt she had been positioned to look bad from the start. Asterisk. She said she refused to sit there and be treated like a subject under interrogation rather than an invited guest. The studio descended into chaos. Producers rushed toward the stage. Audience members gasped and whispered among themselves, and camera operators scrambled to capture every angle of the unfolding confrontation. Kelly's voice rose sharply as she insisted that Valerie was overreacting, claiming they had simply been having a discussion and that storming out was an extreme response to a minor disagreement. Valerie turned to her fully then, her expression a mixture of disbelief and profound disappointment. She said calling this a simple disagreement was a blatant minimization of what had actually happened, and that Kelly knew exactly what she was doing by framing her questions the way she had. In all her years in the industry, Valerie continued, she had learned to recognize when someone was genuinely curious versus when they were deliberately trying to provoke conflict. And this conversation had clearly been the latter. Kelly's face flushed a deep shade of red, and her voice sharpened into something brittle and defensive. She accused Valerie of twisting the intent behind perfectly legitimate questions and suggested that perhaps Valerie's extreme defensiveness came from the fact that deep down she knew there was some truth to what was being pointed out. If Valerie's conscience were really clear, Kelly argued, then a few difficult questions shouldn't have triggered such an intense reaction. The audacity of that statement silenced the room. Valerie stared at her, stunned, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but far more cutting than before. She told Kelly that she had just exposed the real issue. This wasn't about accountability or meaningful dialogue. It was about judgment. Kelly had already decided Valerie was in the wrong and had used her platform not to understand, but to prosecute her in front of millions. Kelly crossed her arms tightly, visibly hardening. She said Valerie was putting words in her mouth and that she hadn't judged anyone. She had simply asked fair questions based on Valerie's public statements and partnerships. If those questions made Valerie uncomfortable, Kelly argued, perhaps that discomfort was worth examining instead of deflecting. She added pointedly that running away from difficult conversations was exactly the problem. With celebrity culture, Everyone wanted control over their narrative without ever facing real scrutiny. Valerie let out a humorless laugh. She said Kelly was confusing scrutiny with judgment. And there was a huge difference between holding someone accountable and cornering them with questions designed to make them look hypocritical. She reminded Kelly that every question she had asked today was framed in the most negative possible way, assuming the worst about Valerie's motivations instead of approaching the conversation with generosity or nuance. The audience was riveted now, some with their hands over their mouths. Others leaning so far forward they were practically on the edge of their seats. The tension in the room had intensified from uncomfortable to electric. The kind of charged atmosphere that comes from watching something that should be private play out in front of cameras. Kelly threw up her hands in exasperation. She said she couldn't win, that no matter what she said, Valerie seemed determined to paint her as the villain. She insisted she had been trying to have an honest conversation, had even been vulnerable about her own struggles with divorce and body image, and thought they could connect as to women who had lived through similar pain. She said it genuinely hurt that Valerie had interpreted her questions as attacks, rather than attempts to understand. For a moment, Valerie's expression softened, though the anger beneath it still simmered. She replied that if Kelly had truly wanted to understand, she would have asked questions rooted in curiosity instead of accusation. Every question Kelly had asked today, Valerie said, was loaded with the assumption that she was doing something wrong, being hypocritical, disingenuous, or inconsistent, and starting from that premise made honest conversation impossible. Kelly shook her head vigorously, insisting that Valerie was misrepresenting her intentions. She maintained that she had only raised concerns voiced by fans and followers, and that, as a host, her job was to give voice to what people might be wondering. Valerie, she added, seemed to want praise for her vulnerability, but bristled the moment that vulnerability was examined or questioned. That comment reignited the fire in Valerie's eyes. She said there was a world of difference between examining someone's vulnerability and weaponizing it, by bringing up her struggles and immediately pivoting to accusations of hypocrisy. Kelly had essentially punished her for being honest. She said this was exactly why so many people, especially women, kept their battles to themselves. Because the moment they opened up, someone would use that vulnerability against them. Kelly's frustration flared. Questioning contradictions wasn't weaponizing anything. She argued was critical thinking. She said that in an era where celebrities could say anything without pushback, her show was one of the few places where real conversations could happen. If Valerie couldn't handle being part of that kind of conversation, Kelly suggested maybe she should stick to platforms where she had full control over the narrative. The condescension in her tone was unmistakable. Valerie's jaw tightened, and she stepped toward Kelly, not aggressively, but with a clear refusal to back down. She said Kelly was now openly insulting her, implying she was too fragile or controlling to handle discourse, when the truth was that today hadn't been discourse at all. It had been an ambush disguised as an interview. Kelly recoiled slightly, startled by the intensity of Valerie's words. She tried once again to label Valerie's reaction as overblown, but Valerie immediately cut her off. She said Kelly's repeated insistence that she was overreacting was nothing more than a silencing tactic, a way to make Valerie feel like her emotional response was the real issue rather than the behavior that had provoked it. Behind them, the production team was in full crisis mode, people with headsets whispering urgently, gesturing, signaling, likely desperate to cut to commercial. But Kelly seemed too caught up in the escalating confrontation to notice. She was locked in now, mirroring Valerie's unyielding stance. Kelly insisted she wasn't trying to silence anyone, that if anything, Valerie had been speaking at great length, while she herself was being accused unfairly for simply doing her job. She said she was being punished for trying to create substantive content, the kind her audience came for. Valerie responded that substantive content didn't require gotcha journalism. There were ways to ask challenging questions without making a guest feel cornered and diminished. Valerie added that Kelly's inability to hear feedback about how her questions had landed was telling. It showed she was more invested in being right than in understanding how her actions had affected someone else. Something shifted in Kelly's expression. Then an almost visible transformation. The fierce defensiveness softened around the edges, replaced by something quieter. Hurt, realization, or perhaps the shock of finally hearing the impact of her own words. In a low, unsteady voice, she said she had been listening. She had heard everything. Valerie said that maybe they both needed to take a step back and breathe. She said that clearly something had gone wrong and that she didn't want things to end like this. But Valerie was already shaking her head before Kelly even finished speaking. Valerie said it was too late for that, now that the damage had been done. And she couldn't sit there and pretend everything was fine when it obviously wasn't. She explained that she'd tried multiple times to articulate how Kelly's questions had made her feel. But every response from Kelly had been self-defensive rather than understanding. That pattern alone, she said, told her everything she needed to know about whether continuing this conversation would be productive. Kelly's eyes glistened. Whether from frustration, hurt, or anger was unclear. She insisted she had heard Valerie. She did understand she was upset. But she still believed her questions had been fair and necessary. She said she couldn't apologize for doing journalism, even if it made people uncomfortable, because that was the point. Comfort wasn't the goal, truth was. And sometimes searching for truth meant pushing into uncomfortable territory. Valerie's response was sharp and immediate. She said Kelly was hiding behind the word journalism to avoid taking responsibility for how she'd treated a guest. Good journalism, she argued, required empathy and context, not just provocation. What Kelly was calling truth-seeking looked far more like point-scoring. If this was Kelly's version of journalism, Valerie wanted no part of it. The audience gasped. This wasn't just disagreement anymore. Valerie had directly challenged Kelly's professional integrity. Kelly went pale, then flushed red. Her voice trembled as she said Valerie had crossed a line. Criticize the questions all she wanted, Kelly said, but attacking her ethics was unfair. Her show had won awards. Countless guests had praised the depth of her interviews, and one bad moment didn't erase an entire career. Valerie replied that she wasn't invalidating Kelly's whole body of work. She was simply speaking to her personal experience. And this experience, she said, had been anything but thoughtful. Awards meant nothing if the person receiving them couldn't accept criticism from someone who'd actually been on the receiving end of her questioning. A good interviewer, Valerie added, wasn't defined by how they handled agreeable guests, but how they responded when someone pushed back. Kelly looked stunned. She pointed out that Valerie had been pushing back for the last 15 minutes, and she'd allowed it had engaged with it. Even as Valerie grew increasingly hostile. She could have cut the segment at any moment, Kelly said, but she didn't. Because she believed in giving guests space to speak. Now Valerie was weaponizing that openness and claiming it proved Kelly was a bad interviewer. Valerie countered that allowing someone to speak wasn't the same as actually listening. Kelly's continued defense of her original questions proved she hadn't absorbed anything. Valerie had been trying to communicate. Instead of reflecting on the possibility she'd misstepped, Kelly had spent the entire exchange justifying herself. That was the breaking point. Kelly's composure cracked completely. Her voice shook as she said she was human too. She genuinely tried her best. And being accused of being a bad person and a bad interviewer cut deeply. Her whole career had been built on connecting with people. Maybe, she admitted, she had framed some things poorly. But Valerie's refusal to give even an ounce of grace made resolution impossible. She felt like she was being crucified for trying to have a real conversation instead of offering empty softball questions. Asterisk for the first time, Valerie's expression softened. There was a hint of sympathy or maybe exhaustion. She said she wasn't trying to crucify anyone. She was trying to protect herself from feeling worse than she already did. Kelly might not have intended harm, but intention mattered less than impact. And the impact of this interview had been deeply painful. She said she needed to leave before she said something she'd regret before the damage became even more irreparable. Asterisk Kelly reached out, her hand hovering in the space between them, pleading for them to take a break and try again with a different approach. She didn't want things to end like this. They were both smart, articulate women who cared about important issues. Surely they could find common ground if they tried. But Valerie was already moving off the stage. She said some things couldn't be fixed in the moment. Sometimes stepping away was the only way forward. She needed space, needed not to be on camera, not to feel every word being analyzed and judged. Kelly called after her, but Valerie didn't stop. Asterisk the audience reacted awkwardly, part stunned silence, part scattered applause, filling the room with an uneasy echo. Cameras followed Valerie's rigid posture as she exited, her face controlled but not quite able to mask the emotion beneath. Kelly stood alone on stage, looking lost and shaken, the usual polish stripped away. She told the audience she didn't know what to say, that this wasn't how it was supposed to go, that she'd never had a guest walk out before. Her voice was small, vulnerable, entirely unlike her usual warm confidence. She said she'd only wanted a meaningful conversation, not to hurt anyone. Asterisk a producer hurried to the edge of the stage, gesturing urgently. Kelly took a deep breath, straightened, and looked into the camera. She said they needed to take a break and that she'd try to make sense of what had just happened when they returned. But her eyes showed she had no idea how to explain what had unfolded, how to contextualize something that had spiraled so far beyond control. Asterisk. The camera lingered on her face, confusion, regret, defensiveness, hurt, before cutting away. Somewhere off stage, Valerie was no doubt processing her own emotional storm, grappling with what had just played out in front of millions. Moments like this captivate audiences because they strip away polish and reveal something raw and real, even when that reality is difficult to watch. Two accomplished, admired women, suddenly on opposite sides of a conflict neither fully understood. Neither knew how to resolve. It was messy, painful, and profoundly human.